Hamish de Breton-Gordon, thank you so much for your time today, former British Army Colonel. I want to start off, as the war rages on between Russia and Ukraine, it can be hard for the world to kind of keep up to date with what exactly is happening in the situation between these two countries. Can you kind of give an explanation of where we're at?
Well, at the moment, we're in the depths of winter, very harsh winter in Ukraine, and the fighting is very much static. We've got hundreds of thousands of Russians in trenches on one side and slightly less Ukrainian forces on the other. The fighting at the moment is very much precision-guided artillery, the Ukrainians striking deep into the Russian forces, attacking key command nodes, and the Russians firing thousands, if not millions, of artillery rounds at Ukrainian positions in what we call the deep battle. In other words, away from the very front lines. The Russians are firing a whole range of missiles and drones at key cities in Ukraine, mainly Kyiv, to attacking civilian infrastructure, attacking the power grid. And the Ukrainians are firing depth missiles into Crimea, also into some of the key ports in the Black Sea to try and break down some of the Russian logistics support. But we're at a sort of standoff at the moment. And as the world is looking elsewhere, particularly to the Middle East, and as we prepare for what is going to happen in the spring when the real fighting will start again, it's very key that particularly the West, the UK and NATO countries keep their focus on Ukraine, because if Ukraine doesn't prevail, I agree with the chief security minister of Poland that NATO could be at war with Russia within the next 3 years.
Hamish, in the last week, Russia has ramped up their attacks on Ukraine and vice versa. Can you kind of explain to me how the situation has escalated in just the last week since around December 29th?
I think on the Russian side, they have been storing up some of their precision-guided drones, their precision-guided missiles, and Russia does not have an endless supply of them. And what has been very effective from the Ukrainian position is their air defense. Their air defense missiles are, at the moment, taking out about 95% of the missiles being fired at Ukraine. But Putin, I think, has a sniff of victory, and he is trying to do all that he can to try and force the hand, which is why he's throwing everything at Ukraine at the moment. And Ukraine is sort of virtually hanging on by its fingertips, why President Zelensky is asking for more ammunition, more air defense missiles. So particularly the Russians, are just trying to get a bit of an advantage. They see a chink in the armor, particularly the Western support, with America in particular focusing on Israel and giving them ammunition. Putin is very well aware that we have elections coming up in the UK, in Europe, and in the States this year now. And there is a swing of opinion in a lot of Western countries that perhaps the support given to Ukraine cannot endure for that much more. So that's why Putin is really throwing everything he can into it. He's got 600,000 troops in Ukraine. There are reports that they've had 500,000 casualties, which is First World War scale. Putin himself has an election. I mean, election is a bit of a comical thing for Russia. Everybody expects Putin to get 99% of the vote, but he does have an election coming up. There are people in Russia who are realizing the folly of his special military operation, particularly the oligarchs who he's really tightened up on, who can't go to their villas in the Mediterranean and around in their yachts. So I think everybody is seeing quite what an important time in the war this is. If Putin does get his nose in front in the next few months, then we could have real serious problems. And unfortunately, a lot of politicians in the West are beginning to look elsewhere. But crucially, I don't believe that anything happening in the Middle East is going to create a European war. But if it goes wrong in Ukraine, I absolutely think that NATO and the European NATO countries could certainly be at war with Russia within the next few years.
Do you think there is speculation to believe that these countries, Britain, Australia, the United States, could actually be physically sending in their troops to Ukraine, like you said, because there hasn't been any of that? We actually haven't had, soldiers from these NATO countries, soldiers going in and helping Ukraine. We've been sending all of our military aid, we've been sending financial aid, humanitarian aid. But is 2024 going to see all of these Western allies send their soldiers over to actually fight?
Well, you're absolutely right. The Western allies have done everything except put their own troops on the ground thus far. And it is not beyond the bounds of possibility that if Russia starts to make some serious progress, that NATO and Western allies like Australia are going to have to consider their position. What is clear, I think, to me and a lot of others who watch this war very closely, is that if Putin prevails in Ukraine, he will not stop there. And of course, the first time he attacks a NATO country, and the next countries beyond Ukraine are NATO countries, that will bring the West into conflict. Now, it might well be that if NATO leaders see that as a possibility, then they may well have to commit forces to prevent that happening, which could possibly mean, British and other NATO forces actually fighting in Ukraine. Now, that is still some way off, which is why it's so important. And I absolutely agree with President Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, that West must step up its provision of ammunition in particular and other arms to Ukraine to make sure that that doesn't happen. Because there is a possibility that war will be joined in Europe with NATO, but we must do everything ahead of that to make sure it doesn't happen.
Hamish, if that hypothetical situation happens, whether it's this year or next, where we've got Western allies physically going over to fight, do you think there's any reason to believe that Russia, in the face of that, could join forces with China or Iran or North Korea to, become allies to verse the Western allies?
If NATO decided to fully commit to this war, I expect it would be over fairly rapidly. However, the point of Russia trying to gather allies, well, we are very clear. We understand that Iran is a very close ally of Russia. It is Iran who are providing a vast majority of the drones, the Shahed drones that are attacking Ukraine every day. And Iran has vast forces. We know that Russia is supporting Iran to flare up the Middle East, in Gaza and in Lebanon with Hezbollah and Hamas. So, yeah, it is absolutely not beyond the bounds of possibility. The one thing I would caveat this is China. I don't see China allying with Russia to fight the West. China is entirely reliant on Western money, Western markets, to fuel its economy. And of course, North Korea is providing it with a lot of ammunition. But actually, on the global scale, these countries are fairly small. But at the moment, Russia is fighting a similar country, Ukraine, with similar forces, and therefore that's why it's balanced. If NATO wanted to get this over quickly, it would put its full military force behind it to finish it off. But Western leaders, obviously don't want to do that. They don't want to see British, Australian, and American troops on the ground fighting in Ukraine. They want to try and avoid that. But we are getting to a position where purely by providing ammunition and hardware like F-16 jets and Challenger 2 tanks, it is not doing the trick. So if things don't change in the next few weeks or months, then NATO might have to get boots on the ground.
Well, on that note, regardless of actually sending soldiers in, the war is dragging into its third year. Do you think these ally countries, such as the US, the UK and Australia, will continue providing this aid? Because, for instance, the UK and the US, they are heading into elections, and the US provides the most money out of any other country, a lot of money, and a lot of money that cuts into their federal debt. And when they're heading into a presidential election, it does play on voter concerns. So I do wonder, when we head into another year of war, if this will become a situation where these countries have to say, look, we can't afford it anymore.
Well, you're very perceptive. Absolutely right. I think for a lot of people in the States, in the US, their domestic media is not full of the war in Ukraine like perhaps it is in Europe and other Western countries, and their focus is on their own bank balances. And one can quite see a situation, come the end of this year, particularly if there's a Republican government in the US, that aid and that money will dry up. Now, the US can probably afford for that to happen, but certainly countries in Europe, the UK, Germany, France, Ukraine itself, Poland, cannot afford for Russia to be dominating Europe. And if Ukraine doesn't prevail this year, we will have to fight.
Hamish, from your knowledge of this area, obviously you've been, covering this so much and have your ear to the ground. What really is kind of the most needed aid, military, humanitarian assistance, whatever it may be, that Ukraine currently needs to kind of get the upper hand in this war?
Well, the number one thing at the moment is ammunition. Russia has about 5 times the amount of ammunition. That's artillery ammunition. And what Ukraine needs is that. It needs precision-guided missiles, the US HIMARS, the British Storm Shadow, which are in short supply. And it needs that to prevail. What is coming over the hill very soon are F-16 fighter jets. Now, this war that's been going on for 2 years, throughout it, Russia has had air superiority. It's very difficult. I was a tank commander for many years. It's very difficult to fight on the ground if you don't have air superiority, as we did in the 2 Gulf Wars and in Afghanistan. Now, if Ukraine can get air superiority with those F-16 jets, it can then use all its Western tanks, Western armored vehicles, and other assets to drive into the Russian forces and hopefully defeat them. But predominantly, it's ammunition. If the Ukrainian guns run dry of ammunition, then they are really with their backs against the wall. And again, that is where NATO, particularly the European countries, will be very close to having to commit their own troops into Ukraine.
Just finally, Hamish, do you believe that Putin thinks he's winning, or is he just putting on a facade that he thinks he's winning?
Well, it's a really good, really difficult question to answer. I think Putin is told by his advisors pretty much what he wants to hear. And Putin is an autocratic tyrant and believes what he wants to believe. And sat in his sort of armored dacha in the Kremlin, I don't think he's getting a really clear picture. But yeah, I think 2 years down the line, he is unconcerned on how many hundreds of thousands of soldiers he sends to their death. He's unconcerned about the Russian economy, and he seems to unconcerned about the Russian people, who really don't know what's going on either, and is blindly followed by oligarchs who he fills their bank accounts with gold. So I think he thinks that he's not losing, and I think he thinks that if he can hang on this year, America will turn its back and focus inwards. NATO may well not have the stomach for a fight. And yeah, he probably thinks if he can see out this time next year, if he's still around, then he will claim some sort of victory.
Hamish to Breton-Gordon, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure.